So we are on Chaf Amud Beis 20b, just before the end of the daf. We are in the midst of a conversation of what we know that for a human to be able to drink from one domain to another domain, for a person to drink from a Rishus HaRabim to Rishus HaYachid or vice versa, he's going to have his head and most of the torso in the other domain. And the question is, what would be the halacha for an animal? And we're trying to prove that. So Tashema is about 7-8 lines from the bottom of 20b. Tashema, come in here. Gummel, a camel, sherosh v'ruba bifnim, that its head and its torso, or most of its torso, is inside the pasi biro, is inside this enclosure made by these L-shaped corners. You can put the food, the drink in front, meaning you can stuff food into its mouth while it's inside this enclosure. So in that case, when you stuff the animal into its mouth, you're actually holding the food and holding the animal. So you see that you need its head torso in the private domain, and you're holding both the animal and the food. And so in our case, it would be the water, and that would be permissible. Okay, and even though that you're holding both the animal and the food, nevertheless, you have to be, it has to be both most of its torso in the domain. So you see that that's a requirement. Amar Rav Acha, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Shesha, Shani Gamel. Maybe the reason is that it's distinct. A camel is different on account of that it has a long neck, and because it has a long neck, that's why it may end up turning itself out, and that's why you have to have that both its torso is also in. But if it was a small animal with a smaller neck like a cow, then you wouldn't need. If you're holding it, you wouldn't need both its even its torso in there. Amar Rav Acha, that can't be. An animal that its head and its torso is inside, and here it doesn't say camel, right? It just says an animal. Then you can stuff it on the inside. You can feed it on the inside. Over there also it just says generally an animal, and it says both. You're going to hold it and its and the food, and it requires also that the head and the torso are in. So you see that you need both head and most of the torso in, as well as that you're holding the animal and the feed. Okay, so Gemara says, "My behemoth, not the karatani gamal." No, that brisa too, and it means a long-necked animal such as a camel. So Gemara says it can't be vatani behemoth, vatani gamal, but it says both. It says a camel and it says a behemoth, an animal. So if it means camel specifically, then it wouldn't say it in two separate statements: an animal, and then there's another brisa that says camel. So Gemara says, "Midi gabi adadi tani." Are these brises said as one? These are separate teachings. One was written as animal, but it meant long-necked animal like camel, and one said camel, but they weren't said in one statement, and therefore you cannot from the brisa that it means camel, that it means another animal besides a camel, and therefore indeed only a camel that has a long neck which can turn away, and therefore you need both the head and the torso in the area, but in the private domain in Rishus HaYachid. But if you have an animal that has a smaller neck, like a cow, indeed, perhaps if you're holding both the animal and the food, or the water in our case, you wouldn't need the head and the torso inside the space. Tani Namahachi, indeed, we have a brisa like that. Rabbi Leza that Rabbi Leza says that you're not allowed to feed a camel that way, because it has a long neck and it may turn its neck out, and then you're going to carry the food with its, to try and feed it outside of the domain. Now we have this that we said, that because water is so necessary, we're going to go to the minimum barriers needed, the minimum enclosure, which is pasei b'rois, these L-shaped corners, and that's going to be sufficient. Even though that generally we say that's not a sufficient enclosure, because it's too open even though it has an enclosure on all four sides, and on Torah level, it's going to be enough. But for most people, it doesn't look like an enclosure, and therefore the Chachamim said we can't rely on that. This leniency for water is only when it's needed for a mitzvah, meaning it's needed for the travelers. This is on a public domain where you don't have water. Where do you don't have water? You're outside of a city. If you're outside of a city, on Shabbos, you're not allowed to travel outside of a city. You have a maximum amount of that you're allowed to go, and even there, you should only go if you need it for a mitzvah. We'll see later. So these travelers were doing a mitzvah. What were they doing? Ola regel. They were going to do the pilgrimage, the aliyah regel for Chag. And so they needed to make up as much ground as possible on Shabbos. So they were in one city at the beginning of Shabbos, and they would move to the next city that was within the minimum domain. They were within the 2,000 Amma, and they would go there on Shabbos. Similarly with Su later in the Gemara, also for studying in the yeshiva. If somebody lived in one village and the Talmud Chacham was in the larger city that was within the domain, they would walk there on Shabbos in order to be able to learn, or they would make an Eruv between them in order to travel there on Shabbos. To go 4,000 amma, but the point is, the reason they needed water was for a mitzvah, and only then is it permissible to rely on these pasei biros, on these this minimal enclosure of having L-shaped corners on the four sides in order to permit drinking from the well, which would bring the water up from a private domain into a public domain.
I'm remembering somewhere in some Gemara it talks about. This was like a big chesed that the people did for the Ole Regel. That there was like
yes, there was such a thing, the Be'er Agula, which was made a specific well that people made for the travelers, right? But here we're not talking about who made the well. Here we're talking about the permission to use this minimal enclosure, the pasei birois, on account of the need for drinking while traveling on Shabbos, because generally you don't travel on Shabbos.
I'm just saying that they were established
for a mitzvah. The traveling on Shabbos was for a mitzvah, either for aliyah l'regel or to go study in the academy by the Talmidei Chachamim, and that's why it would be permissible to rely on the most minimal enclosure.
I'm just saying it was established by a group of people for a very specific purpose. It wasn't like anybody wants, it's like the people who lived in the town could go there. I mean, it was just like, it was a special thing set up for the Ole Regel. So I'm saying,
what?
These bureaus. I mean, you
can do this for any well. No, you can do this. It doesn't have to be those particular wells. It's for any well.
Is the Gemara saying that the only reason we allowed these to be considered barriers in the first place is because they were set for a specific purpose for a specific set of people?
No, you're remembering the specific wells that were made for the Ole Regel.
Yeah.
This halacha is that these pasei biros making such a minimalist enclosure is going to be valid because you need water, but you also has to be that you have a valid reason for traveling on Shabbos. That would be either to go to the academy, to study in the yeshiva, as we'll see soon, or for if you're going to do another mitzvah like aliyah l'regel, or to do bikurim like we'll see in this week's parsha. Either way, there's a reason why on Shabbos you're traveling in this public domain that you need to get yourself some water.
Got it.
So it has to be for some reason of mitzvah. And not only that, another brisa teaches and also only to give the animal to drink, because the human can go into the well to get water. My the animals were for the and why? What kind of animals are we talking about? The animals that were being brought up for the aliyah l'regel, for the chag. Aval Adam, but what does the human do? And now we go to Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. What does the human do? Metapas b'olam, metapas v'yard. He will climb up, climb down. He was allowed to go in and out to get water, and he would do that by using his hands and feet and climbing down the inside of the well wall, and then come back up. So Gemara says, "Eini, it's not so." Well, we have a statement of Shmuel that Shmuel says that it has to be spring water. It's not just rainwater gathered, it has to be spring water. Now, if it's for the animals, but the human, it doesn't need the enclosure because he's going to go into the well, and so he never carries it from a private domain out into the public domain because he's drinking while he's in the private domain because he climbs into the well. But if it's only for animals, what difference does it make if it's well water or spring water? It makes no difference. What difference does it make to the animal whether it's a puddle or whether it's spring water? So the Gemara says, no, it has to be a well that humans can consume, that humans would feel comfortable drinking, and that's a spring water. And then, since it's good for them, so they're going to stop there, and therefore it'll also be good for the animals, and they may bring the water out, and we're afraid they're going to bring the water out to the animal that's in the public domain, because the animal's not going into the well, and therefore the minimal enclosure is going to be sufficient because they're doing a mitzvah, they're traveling for a mitzvah, so it's needed for them. And that would define it because it's water that's good enough for a human, so for him that's a valid enclosure, and therefore it's going to be valid even for the animals. So that's the explanation Rashi gives here. On that, there are various other interpretations. In any case, Somali mechunas. The minimum that's required here is that the well water is good for human consumption, even though the human won't necessarily drink from it. Tues says that it's possible that he would drink from it because once he brings out water for the animals, he himself can also drink from it. But if he was alone, a traveler alone without animals, would actually go into the well, say he doesn't bring water out. So gufa. So let's analyze this statement that really the permission and the need for these minimalist corner enclosure around the well, the Pasei Beroz, is only on account of the animal because the animal can't go into the well, but a human can go into the well. Well, that actually is actually not always that's not always the case, because as we'll see, a human can climb in, but if it's too wide and therefore he can't go in other words, he can't support himself on both sides of the well in order to climb down and climb back up. Well, if that's the case, he can even draw water up from the private domain and drink it in the public domain based on these enclosures. That's going to define this space also as a private domain, and therefore it's going to be permissible. He's allowed to bring it up. Aval, even for himself. And a person should not fill up a bucket of water and put it in front of his animal. But he can fill it up and put it in front of the animal in a trough and let it drink on its own. And as we said, we saw this earlier, and the Gemara is going to challenge again now. What's the concern? Well, if that's the case that he can't even feed it to the animal, so what value is there in this in these pasei beros, in this enclosure based on the corner on the corner walls? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? What did it help? It helped that you're allowed to bring the water up from the private domain, from the well, which is a private domain, into a public domain, into the street. But what difference does it make whether most of the cow fits in or not? We said that the minimum is you have to be able to have 2 amma of space outside of the well in order to have the head and most of its torso in there. What difference does it make? Anyhow, you're not giving it to drink there. You're just pouring it into a trough and it drinks on its own. We're talking about a trough that itself is, as we saw earlier, it's a trough that's standing in the public domain. Only part of it is inside a minimalist enclosure, this pasei beros. And the trough itself is in the public domain, and mostly in the public domain. And he's going to pour the water into there and it's going to run there. And it itself is a private domain. It counts as a private domain because the trough is 10 tefachim deep, let's say 30 tefachim, and for 30 inches, and for wide. And since it counts as its own domain, he can pour the water in there. But the problem is that we're afraid that he's going to carry the water out of the enclosed area into the public domain, into the Rishus Harabim, in order to check the trough out, and that would be a transgression of a Torah transgression of carrying from within a Rishus HaYachid, a private domain, into a public domain.
How about the problem that when he pours the part of the trough that's inside the pasim, so he pours the water in there, but water runs, and the water is going to flow from there into the Rishus Harabim.
But it's its own enclosed Rishus HaYachid. It's its own enclosed space, right? Because it's 10 tefachim deep for what? Got it. Yeah. As we saw earlier. And that's the concern. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah Barabba Amar Rav, Ein Burgen Bavel. So Rav said a halacha that in Bavel, we don't rely on a concept of burgenin. Burgenin are watchers' huts that they would have outside of the village, closer to the fields, that the city designated watch would protect the fields that were outside of the city. Now on Shabbos, we know you're not allowed to travel more than 2,000 amma outside of your city. But how do you define the city? So the halacha is, as long as you have houses within 70 amma and change from each other, that's going to be part of the same city. Another concept is that you square the city, that you don't look at it in a jagged edge, but rather you look at the northmost and the eastmost and the southmost and the westmost points of dwellings, and then you square that, and that's your boundary of your city. So you make a straight line. We'll see more about this, but for now, let's just say there's a straight line along the north side, and a straight line along the south side, and a straight line along the west side and the east side, and that becomes your city boundaries. And that line goes at the easternmost house, and the westernmost house, and the northernmost house, and the southernmost house. And then in Eretz Yisrael would also include not only the houses, but also the dwelling place or the hut that the guard would have outside of the city. As long as it's within 70 or so of the other houses, that would count as a valid house, even though it's not really made for living. But since it's a permanent place, and the guard spends much of the day there, or maybe even there's rotations through the night, and therefore it counts as a part of the village's housing or living space, and that would become the farthest most point, and we'd make a straight line along that dwelling burgenin. But not so in Bavel. In Bavel, we don't rely on the burgenin, as the Gemara is going to tell us, on account of that they get washed away in flash floods. And since they get washed away, it's not really a permanent dwelling, and so that doesn't count. So that's one halacha Rav said, that we don't rely on burgenin in the private, in Bavel, in order to define the boundaries of a city for how far you're allowed to travel on Shabbos. And additionally, he said, and we don't rely on these minimal enclosure around wells outside of Eretz Yisrael, outside of Bavel or Eretz Yisrael. Now, why? Burgen in Bavel, we don't rely on these burgen on watchmen's huts because the shchichi bidki, because floods come and wash it away, and so it's really not a permanent house. And we don't rely on these minimal enclosure around wells to permit drinking from a well on Shabbos, because you don't really have Mesifta academies that are operating on Shabbos, that there's a need to travel. And as we said before, this was permitted on account of somebody's traveling for a mitzvah on Shabbos, so we want them to have available water. But if somebody's traveling for a non-mitzvah, such as to check on their produce, check on their fields, that's not really a Shabbos thing. So you do that, you do so, but you do so at your own peril. So, but it would seem from this statement of Rav that the opposite is okay, that you could have well enclosures in Bavel, and you do have burgenin outside of Eretz Yisrael elsewhere. However, Ikad Amri, that those who say Rabbi Yirmi Bar Abba Rab in the name of Rab in Burgen and Pasibros, both of these don't apply. Lo bebavel, not in Bavel, lo bechutz la'aretz, and not in chutz la'aretz. Burgen and bebavel loy. Why don't we have these watchmen's huts count as a part of the city in order to define its boundaries for Shabbos? The shchichi, they're not permanent housing because they get washed away. Bechutz la'aretz nami loy, and outside of Eretz Yisrael and outside of Bavel as well, you don't the shchichi gamvi. Because they get there's a lot of thieves and they get stolen all the time, so it's not a permanent place. And why don't we rely on this minimal enclosure for wells in Bavel and Babylon? The Shchichi Maya, because there's plenty of water. You don't have to. You don't need this for the travelers. And outside of Eretz Yisrael, also you don't rely on these minimal waters because people don't travel for mitzvah on Shabbos. Because it's not common that there's an academy operating on Shabbos that you need to travel in order to learn Torah. So Rav Chisda said to Mari, the son of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba, and it said to me, that you traveled from Barnish to the shul that Daniel, the famous Daniel from the prophets, that Daniel davened in, and you traveled that distance, and it's beyond 2,000 amma. So what were you relying on? How did you extend the boundaries of the city you were in order to get to count 2,000 amma to get to here? To have a tlosa parsa, because that's 3 parsa. B'Shabsan, you did so on Shabbos. So what were you relying on? A burgenin? Were you relying on the watchmen's huts? But my grandfather said in the name of Rav, "Ein burgenim b'Bavel." That in Bavel we don't rely on these burgenim because they get washed away. So these huts are not permanent housing. Nafek v'achvile. So he went out and he showed him that hani matvata the mivlim b'shivin amma b'shirayim. That he had these ruins, that old houses, even though people were not living there anymore, but it had enough of a function, and we'll see later that it doesn't have to actually be a proper dwelling place. Even some graves can count as the farthest most point of the city, and therefore these ruins to extend the city boundaries because it was within the 70 amma from the next house, and that's to count as a dwelling place. I'm Rav Chisda. So now we can go to some Agarata. I'm Rav Chisda. Darish Mari Bar Mar. What does it mean when it says in the pasuk, L'chol tichla re'isi kates? For everything that's finite, I saw its end. Rechavim mitzvasecha ma'od. But your mitzvah, Hashem, your mitzvahs are very wide. David, something like that, David said. V'lo pirsha, but didn't explain what that, what are the dimensions? What is this width? Amra Eov said something similarly. V'lo pirsha, but didn't explain. Yecheskel said similarly. V'lo pirsha, didn't explain. Until Zechariah Hanavi came, and he said it, and he explained it. Pirsha explained it. So Amra David. David said, Amr David said it, but didn't explain. The Chsifra, it says, as it says over here, that I see for every finite item that I see its end. But your mitzvahs are very wide, and we don't see its end. Amru Eov v'lei Pirsho. Eov said it because he said the Chsiv Arucha me'eretz mida. It is as long as it's longer than the measure of the earth, or and it is wider than the sea. Amr Yecheskel said it and didn't explain it. Yecheskel says, "Vayifrus osalafanai v'hikasuva panim v'achar." He spread it in front of me, and it's written on the front and the back, but it doesn't say how much that was. And it says. And he wrote on it kinim and hege and he. So what is that? Kinim Kinim is the difficulties that righteous people have in this physical world, which is a form of atonement and a form of challenge, which gives them blessing and gives them reward, because in the world of action, they have challenges. And similarly, it says, Kina, this is how do you say Kina? A lamentation. This is a difficulty. Vehege, and it was written also Hege, which is essentially a joy. There also is written the immense reward for tzaddikim, for righteous people in the world to come. And it says, like the songs of joy on a kinor, on a harp. So we see that higoyon is a word, is a term for a thoughtful joy. And vahi, what is vahi? And this is the punishment for the evil in the world to come. As it says about this punishment for the Rishonim, hove ala hove tova, hove, and on hove comes. So this literally means presence on present, the present. And it means this vahi is this the existence of today is going to be their punishment in the world to come. Until Zechariah came and he explained, Zechariah neither appeared and he explained it. It says, in his vision he saw something and he said, what do you see? And I responded, Zechariah says, I see a scroll that's afa, that's been properly prepared. They would scrape the hides in order to make it a good scroll. Arka esrim ba'ama, the length of this scroll is 20 amma, approximately 30 feet. Urechava eser ba'ama, and it is 10 amma wide, let's say 15 feet. But if you unfold it, so then it'll be 20 by 20 because it's folded. And he says that it's written on both sides. So if it's 20 by 20 and it's written on both sides, you essentially have a 40 by 20. That's 20 by 40. And it says, who measured with his hand water, and the heavens were measured by a forearm. So if the heavens are a forearm, and the teachings of the Torah, the depths of the Torah are on a 40 by 20 scroll, which tells you that the entire universe is a one of 3,200 of the Torah. Basically, if the heavens are a half a amma by a half a amma, so that's going to be a 3,200th of a 40 by 20 amma. What does it mean when it says we have two baskets of figs, two baskets of were in front of the mu'adim lefnei hechal. They were set before the Heichal Hashem, before the Beis Hamikdash, and behind the wells, behind the waters. Okay, so this is what Yechaniah at the time of Yechaniah and Nebuchadnezzar is coming in. Now it says in the next pasuk that Haduda Echa Te'enim Tovos. One basket of figs were good figs. Tovos Ma'od, they were very good. Te'ene Habakuros, like the ripe, proper figs. And now we turn to Chaf Aleph on the base. Bahadud Echad, and the other one, Te'enim Rois Ma'od, were very bad. Right, which are not edible. Which are not eaten because of how bad they are. So what are these ripe and good figs? These are the righteous people, completely righteous people. And the bad ones are evil people. Well, if you say, okay, so they're bad figs, so why even in a basket? They're completely a waste. That's why the verse says in Shir Hashirim that the baskets of fruit, the dudaim, give forth its aroma. That in the world to come, even the people that are completely evil will have been cleansed and perfected to the degree that they too will be a part of the good aroma that is given. Darash Rava said, what does it mean that the dudaim give forth a scent, which we in the previous drash said we're talking about baskets of fruit. Here it says dudaim, which we know dudaim is also a type of plant, so it gives its fruit, it gives its aroma. These are the young of Yisrael who never tasted sin, who never had not the opportunity, but they never became sullied by sin. And at our entranceways, at our openings, all beautiful fruit, all tasty fruit. These are the young maidens of Yisrael that tell their openings to their husbands, meaning they notify them when they become nida, so to separate, even though that it's they could keep it silent and no one would know. Others say that they keep themselves pure and chaste until they are with their husbands. Old and new. What are the old and new? So the new and the old. So chadashim, that's the new. That's the teachings of the chachamim, and gam yeshanim, even the old. That's the teachings of the Torah, meaning the Torah Shebeksav, the written Torah. Dodi tzefantilach, my beloved, I hid for you. Amra Knesset Yisrael. So this is Knesset Yisrael, the collective spirit of Am Yisrael said Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu before Hashem, Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe. Ribono Shel Olam, harbe gezeros gazarti al atzmi. I accepted upon myself many fences that are not within the Torah, but they are fences in order that I am able to keep your Torah to the highest degree. More than you placed on me mitzvos, I placed on myself fences in order to keep the Torah. And I keep those fences too. Rav Chisda said to this teacher from the Havakim Masada Agata, who was teaching Agadata, who was teaching Agadaic teachings, halacha, but the depth, the stories and the in-depth meanings of the halacha. Have you learned what is the meaning of the new and the old? Said to him, these are the easy mitzvahs and these are the hard mitzvahs. What the Torah is old and new. It means hard and easy. What the hard was given earlier, or the easy was given earlier? What does that mean? Ella, no, that's not what the real meaning is. Ella halalam midivra Torah, halalam midivra sefer. Rather, the new is the rabbinic teachings, the halachas that came from the chachamim as fences and enactments to enhance the mitzvahs and the Torah, and the yeshanim are the old, which is the original intent of the mitzvah of the Torah, and both of those are something that we keep, and that is our scent, our beauty. Dorash Rava. So Rava said a drash. At the end of Koheles, it says, "And more so, my son, be careful to write svarim, to write books, to write Torah." Now, at the beginning, right before that, it says divrei chachamim kedavronis. Kedarbonis, that the words of the chachamim are like pegs. And those are the words of Torah that were written that were not written in the text explicitly, but were the tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu that were the meaning of the mitzvah, such as that when it says "Uchsavtam al mezuzos besecha," when it says you will write them on your doorpost. We don't write mezuzos on the doorpost, but on a scroll and affix it to the doorpost. And so that's the intent of the mitzvah given to the Chachamim that Chachamim explained. And so B'ni, after that it says, B'ni hizar b'divrei sofrim, be careful with the words of the Chachamim, yosem b'divrei Torah, more than the words of Torah itself. Because the words that were written b'ksav are inexplicable. The words of the Torah itself, as it's written, are just incomprehensible and they're insufficient. And we need the Torah Sheba'al Peh in order to define for us how the mitzvahs are, and we rely on that all the time, both on the incantation, which tells us where to put commas and periods, and on the vowelization, which tells us the tense and the meaning of the word. And therefore, be careful with the Divrei Sofrim, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, more than the written Torah, because the written Torah itself is inexplicable without the Divrei Torah. Shedivrei Torah yesh behem aseh v'lo aseh, because the Divrei Torah itself has the positive and the negative. Avol Divrei Sofrim, but the words of the Sofrim, kol ha'eva Divrei Sofrim chayv misa. If you transgress the meaning of the Torah based on the teaching of the Chachamim, you chayv misa, you lose the mitzvah itself, and that is a capital crime. And if you say, well, if that's the meaning, so why wasn't it actually written? Amar Kra, it says in the pasuk, that's what Shlomo says, Asos Sefarim Harbe, Ein-Kates, in order to have more books and more teaching, Ein-Kates. V'lag Harbe Yigiyas Basar, and in order to toil in it. If everything was spelled out on a silver platter and a golden spoon, then there would be no toil in Torah, there would be investment in Torah, there wouldn't be the human element, our toil and our connection to Hashem through Torah. And we need that as an essence of Torah, and therefore it is not spelled out explicitly, and we need to be able to rely on our teachers and our study in order to get there. Amar Papa B'Reider Rav Acha Bar Adam Eshmeider Rav Acha Bar Ula Melamed Shekala Malaga Devrei Chachamim Nida Mitzvah Sachas. This teaches us from the words V'lahag Harbe Yigiyas Basar, that one who laughs is the drash, then gets a lot of the toil of flesh. What that means is that somebody who laughs at the Chachamim for their interpretations and meaning of the Torah, the waste of the human is what is their punishment. And as it says, that their punishment in the world to come is in human waste. And that means that they've lost the sense of understanding that the human perfects and takes out the good and expels the waste, and that is the Torah's the human toil in Torah to be able to perfect and to extract all the good. Maskef larova mi ksiv laag, but it doesn't say laugh. Lahag ksiv. It says it with a hey. Ela kol hahogebehem toim tambasa. Rather means the other way around. Somebody who toils to try and understand the Torah will be able to perfect and taste of meaning. That is the perfection where somebody can get nourishment even from something physical. That's the human intellect being able to toil and extract from Torah. The story is Rabbi Akiva when he was taken captive by the Romans and he was in prison. Rabbi Yeshua Garsi would serve him, so he would bring him what he needed. Every day we'd bring him a measure of water. One day, the shomer, the guard, found Rabbi Yeshua Garsi going in to bring Rabbi Akiva his needs. He says, "Oh, you have too much water today. I think you're trying to soften the ground of the prison in order to escape." He poured out half the water, and gave him back the remaining half. When he came to Rabbi Akiva, said, "Yeshua, don't you know I'm elderly and I need my life is dependent on you, and you brought me so little water. He told him, I know my Rebbe, I know that, and it pains me, but what should I do? They poured the water out, the guard poured it out. He says, okay, so give me some water so I can wash my hands. There isn't really enough over here for the drinking that you need. You're gonna use some of the water in order to wash your hands? He says, what can I do? Because I have to follow the mitzvahs of the Chachamim, which is to wash hands before I eat, and otherwise it's punishable by death. Mutav emas misas atzmi. I'd rather die by myself, rather than transgressing the words of the majority of my friends, the halacha. So he said he didn't eat anything that day until they brought him water. And he washed his hands. When the Chachamim heard this, Amru, they said, oh my, if this is the energy he gives to Torah and to truth and to fulfilling the mitzvah in his elderly age when he's weak and incarcerated, when he had energy and he was free, how much more so? If he does so in prison, when he was free, how much more so? Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, B'shosha tikkun Shlomo Eruvin u'netilas yadayim. Shlomo HaMelech enacted Eruvin, which is the joining of courtyards in order to be able to carry from one courtyard to the other on Shabbos. U'netilas yadayim and netilas yadayim. That you have to wash your hands before you eat something that's teruma. Yotza Baskal, a heavenly voice came out. Va'amra, he said, Beni, my son, in chachem libcha, if your heart is so wise, yismach libi gamani, my heart is joyous too. Va'amra, it says, chacham beni v'samach libi v'ashiv v'charvi davar. My son is wise, and my heart is glad, and so I can respond to those that mock me with word. Darash Rava said, what does it mean? All right, we're not going to get through all of the Agadata here. I'll just end with one teaching that that a Hasidic Rebbe once said, a beautiful thought. Shlomo enacted Eruvin and Netilas Yadayim. Eruvin is the joining together of courtyards in order to be able to carry on Shabbos, and Netilas Yadayim is washing to sanctify yourself before eating. So both of them are physical participation in the world. One is eating, and one is living and dwelling and mixing with your neighbors. So you have to be able to be involved with your neighbors. You have to be able to mingle with the world, but you also have to be able to cleanse yourself to interact with the world as well. It requires a healthy balance of maintaining who we are and cleansing and doing tahara while interacting with the world as well. Eruvin and Netilas Yadayim, the two enactments of Shlomo HaMelech. Tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem, we'll continue with the Agadata of Rava.